In this short video, we're going to learn how we can solve for the equilibrium in a monopoly market when the buyers are being taxed. Whisk Takers is a local bakery. They're the sole producer of angel food cakes in a small New England town, and as a result, they operate as a monopoly in this market. Their marginal cost function is given by 12 plus 2Q, and they face an inverse demand curve of P equals 48 minus 0.5Q. We're told that Whisk Taker's profit maximizing output is 12 and they charge a price of $42 per cake. Again, this is pre-tax, so this is the equilibrium in the absence of any taxation. Now let's suppose that the government levies a tax of $6 per cake on buyers of cake. We're going to do three things. We're going to determine Whisk Taker's new profit maximizing quantity and price. We're going to figure out how much of the tax consumers pay and how much of the tax Whisk Takers, the producer, will pay. What do we need to know to answer this question? We need to know the firm's total cost or marginal cost function. We need to know demand for their product. This could be either an inverse demand curve or a traditional demand curve. And we also need to know the size of the tax. How are we going to solve this question? We need to start by updating the demand and associated marginal revenue curve to reflect the tax. Once we have this updated marginal revenue curve, we find the new profit maximizing quantity by setting marginal cost equal to the marginal revenue curve. And then finally, we find the new price using the updated demand curve. Let's solve this question. Here's what we know: marginal cost, inverse demand, and the tax. The first thing we're going to find is the profit maximizing quantity and price. So we know this tax is on buyers, so we need to incorporate the tax into the demand curve. How do we do that? Well, it turns out that the demand curve under the tax is just going to be the original inverse demand curve minus the tax. Visually, this is us shifting demand down to reflect the sort of effect that the additional cost has on buyers. So applying what we know, the inverse demand under the tax will be 48 minus 0.5Q minus the tax, which is $6. Final update gives that the inverse demand under the tax is 42 minus 0.5Q. Once we have that inverse demand, we can use it to find the updated total and marginal revenue curves. Total revenue is price times quantity. In this case, that will be 42 minus 0.5Q times Q. Expanding that parenthetical gives us 42Q minus 0.5Q squared. And then from that total revenue curve, we can find marginal revenue as the derivative of total revenue with respect to Q. In this case, that will be 42 minus Q. So we have our inverse demand curve, which we'll need later, as well as our updated marginal revenue curve, which we'll also need later. Now we just proceed in the standard way. What I mean by that is we're going to set marginal cost equal to this updated marginal revenue curve, and that will allow us to solve for the quantity under the tax. So the marginal cost is 12 plus 2Q. We set that equal to 42 minus Q, and we solve for Q. So collecting our Q's together, we have 3Q is equal to 42 minus 12, which is 30. 30, not 3Q. And then dividing both sides by 3, we get that the quantity under the tax is 10. The final step to finding the new profit maximizing quantity and price is to substitute that Q equals 10 into the updated inverse demand curve. So we're going to substitute it into here. A common student mistake is to plug it into the original inverse demand curve. That's wrong. You have to plug it into the updated demand curve. So we get that the price under the tax is equal to 42 minus 0.5 times 10. So that's PT equals 42 minus 5, which is $37. So we have our final solution. The price is $37 and the number of units sold is 10. The last thing we're going to do is we are going to determine how much of the tax do consumers pay and how much of the tax does the monopolist pay. In order to answer this question, we need to remind ourselves that when there is no tax, the price was $42. So let's start with consumers. Consumers used to pay $42. Now they pay $37, but that's not the entire story because they are the ones who are being taxed. So we can almost say that their total payment is equal to $37 plus the $6 tax, which is $43. I'm going to write that so you can actually read it. 43. There we go. So their total payment under the tax is actually $43, and they used to only pay $42. So it should be clear that what do they pay? Consumers pay the difference, 43 minus 42, which is equal to $1 of the tax. How much do producers pay? The monopolist in this case. Well, Whisk Takers, the monopolist, used to charge $42. Now they charge $37. So that must mean that they are paying the difference between those two numbers, 42 minus 37, which is equal to $5 of the tax. So conceptually, just step back for a second. We see that consumers ultimately pay a total of $43 because of the tax. They used to only pay $42. So they bear $1 of the burden of the tax. Producers used to charge $42 a unit. Now they can only get away with charging $37. So they are getting $5 less per cake. They must be bearing $5 of the tax.